will we be such wise enough elves that we'll be able to articulate and express, literally take out from our understanding and write down in a fixed way all of the features of what it is to be a human, and therefore we can actually build it into the machine? Well, that now sounds idolatrous, because now we're acting like gods, the very thing that Scripture has warned us from doing. So it becomes preposterous.
Last year, I debated Kenneth Cukier, a journalist at The Economist, on whether AI is an existential risk, and it got a little spicy in parts.
This idea of self-preservation, what is it founded on? Well, because human beings are by nature self-preservational animals, in the training data will be this concept of self-preservation. But it is an algorithm. It is not a human being. Human beings do have self-preservation. Why? Because we're mortal. Because we have a soul to damn and a body to kick. A transistor doesn't have those things.
Ken mentioned that it would come from the training data. That wasn't my argument at all. This is not something that we could just pick up from the training data. I'm saying this is a logical consequence of rational agents pursuing goals.
Chris, I'll let you rebut that if you want, because I'm sure you don't agree with it.
Well, it's quite correct.
I was giving you a stronger argument. When I say that it's in the training data, it's to say, no, it's baked in. It's there. I get it. Self-preservation, it could be there. But that's actually the first part of the training. What's the second? 4 letters. Reinforcement learning from human feedback. Human beings have been riven through the algorithm all the way through, so the output is highly controlled.
I think this belies some misunderstanding of what RLHF can really achieve. RLHF is the equivalent of sticking tape over the mouth of the large language model while leaving all of that knowledge intact.
Ever since that debate, I've been wanting to have a longer conversation with Ken, because his views around AI and spirituality seem interesting to me. So I was delighted when he agreed to do a podcast interview. We debated whether spirituality is required for AGI, whether you could even make spiritual machines if you wanted to, reviving frozen hamsters in the microwave, and of course, AI doom. Hello, today I'm here with Kenneth Cukier, Deputy Executive Editor at The Economist. Kenneth was co-author of the best-selling book Big Data, A Revolution That Will Transform How We Work, Live and Think in 2013, and more recently the book Framers, Human Advantage in an Age of Technology and Turmoil in 2021, which we'll talk about today. I first met Ken in a debate on whether AI was an existential risk at UCL. I think we both threw a couple of zingers, but I'm sure it'll be a friendlier conversation this time. Glad to have you, Ken.
So happy to be here. Thank you so much, Ruben.
You've said in the past that AGI, despite it being the holy grail of AI companies, so AGI would be AI that can do any cognitive task, at least as well as a human can. You've argued that this term is nonsense and that we'll never be able to create it. Could you explain your reasoning there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing I need to do is to say, look, everyone's always been surprised by technology. And it's almost axiomatic that people say the profoundest inaccuracies when they do. Rutherford saying the idea that you could get energy from an atom would be, quote unquote, complete moonshine. He said that on something like September 11th, 1920 or so, around that time. And of course, what was so relevant about it was that there was the very same day that in his journal, Leo Szilard was able to identify that he actually had figured out a way to actually split an atom and therefore get energy. So it's just these clashes are monumental. And of course, everything that Jules Verne wrote about that seemed to be science fiction within a century was actually happening. A man on the moon, television, radio, airplanes, etc. That said, I do think it is, we should think about, understand what we mean by the words, what we could mean in a petty and superficial way, but what we could mean in a profound way, and I'll stand by that claim. So what do we mean by AGI, artificial general intelligence? It's not a scientific term. It's a term that everyone has a slightly different definition for. And sometimes it's used for certain reasons to advocate on certain positions. But basically, the petty version of it is that which is to say a simplistic version is that, as you put it, a machine can do, AI system can do everything that a human can do, generally speaking. Okay. Now, if that's the standard, if that's a very low standard, it doesn't say it might be authentic, but it might just be an imitation. So for example, if I can recite Shakespeare and then the AI can recite Shakespeare, well, tick, it passes that element of the test. can it do absolutely everything? Well, if the person is an imbecile versus a genius, that's different. Of course, the irony today is that AI actually is very good at the things that require superb genius, and it sometimes falls down on very basic things, like famously from Gary Marcus's research, the great AI pioneer and skeptic. If you ask it, for a treatise that brings together, 15 of the most important thinkers in Oriental, Chinese, Western, and Russian Orthodox philosophy together in a essay of 1,001 words, it will produce you an essay, but it doesn't have a word counter to it, so it won't actually get it. But a human being would easily be able to count out the numbers. So the basic person would be able to do something that the AI can't do. Okay.
Yeah, I think these tests are really unfair, because the way a human would do this would be to write the essay first, then count the words, and then backtrack and fix it later.
Doesn't matter.
Whereas we don't give the AIs the opportunity to do this.
Well,
in these tests that Gary Marcus does.
Should it matter?
Absolutely should. It's not a fair comparison.
Hold on a second. Well, if you're outcome driven and it fails that, let's go to that bit in a second. I'll first make out the claim of why I think the G in a profound sense doesn't work. Okay. In an imitative sense, where AI is a simulation of its training data and therefore can extrapolate beyond it, yes, the AI will probably be able to do lots of things, probably not all, but lots of things that a human being can do. So in my cosmology, we already have superintelligence, and we have had it for at least a decade, maybe two, right? We already have computer systems that exceed human intelligence by leaps and bounds, right? A database can do that, but of course it can do it only in terms of its formal instructions. AI allows it to make inference. It's going to be based on Bayesian, not Boolean logic. So it lives in the world of blurriness, and just as human beings do. And interestingly, and so it can actually create the output that resembles so authentically, I don't think it's actually authentic, but so much of a resemblance of what a human does, that it definitely meets the standard of superintelligence. And of course, it's just going to get better. But is it the G of the profound G, that it can literally do everything a human being can do? Well, that would presume that it has all of the traits of the mental and the cognitive features of a human being. That would mean that it has both intuition and instinct, as well as just raw cognition. Now, on a cognitive basis, on an analytical, logical, rational, think through things basis, AI is extraordinary and also just thumps human beings. But humans aren't only hyper-rational and just simply cognition. We also, I believe, exist in a different sphere. It would be the sphere of the symbolic, of the mythic, of the value-driven, of deeper meaning and higher purpose. And you could call that the spiritual dimension, but it could be spiritual like William Blake, not spiritual like Pope Leo XIV. But in that, and so it could be spiritual in the John McEnroe tennis sort of way. It would be where we transcend ourselves and exist in a different plane. It could be a plane of sportsmanship. It could be a plane of love. It can be a plane of evil. Okay. At that level, I don't think AI can do that. And if it does it inauthentically based on its training data. It's not native to the AI in the way that it is native or authentic to the human being. And it's for that reason I don't think machine consciousness can exist other than in this petty form of imitation, that AGI, that G will be an asymptote in which it will always become close to, but never be the thing, in the same way that a lot of is different than all, and those two are two categorically different things. In that sense, I think there's something special and indeed sacred about human beings. We're animate, we're motivated by a life force, and we exist on these multiple planes, not just, and our minds do, and it's not simply the rational and the cognitive.
Yeah, that was brilliant. I think there's a lot there that I'd like to pick up on. Maybe first, the part about intuition. So it's perhaps a poor example, but the way AlphaGo and AlphaZero worked, for example, was partly through this rational search process of searching possible moves in the future of the game, but also through what you could argue is a kind of intuition about which states of the board are good for AlphaGo and which are bad for AlphaGo. And that intuition gets trained and honed through playing millions and millions of games until the AI can look at a board position and, without logically branching out to future possibilities, immediately say whether it thinks this position is good or not for itself. Is that not intuition?
It's a good question. It resembles intuition. It certainly does. And in some instances, a human intuition is a form of pattern recognition. I believe when it comes to, and I think this has been well documented in the case of chess, when you look at expert, grandmasters looking at board configurations, they immediately can size things up because they've seen so many of them before that what they're describing as intuition is actually just an enlightened or an enhanced sense of pattern recognition. So I think those two things then would be comparable. As you said, it's about being trained and honed, and therefore it has this ability to size up an answer very quickly without going through all of the tree structure to find out what is the optimal and the best. Of course, it can't in the case of Go because it's just too complicated. Okay, so it has to rely on that pruning to get the best, and of course, it does better than anyone else and come up with a new strategy. But I think there's a different dimension of intuition that we don't understand very well in cognitive science, that operates at a different level. It's the intuition of what you say to a friend when you've just found out they've lost their spouse, right? Where you don't have anything planned to say, but you see them and you just say the right thing, or you don't say anything at all, right? What's happening there? I'm sure for lots of people, this will touch them. They'll have experience in that either as a recipient to it, have watched it, or they themselves have been in that situation. It doesn't happen all the time. I don't think just as we don't use our reason all the time, I think most of us live most of our life without actually applying rational, deliberate thinking to what we do. It takes a very special step with which to do that. So too, we don't live in this intuitive sense of trusting our gut, etc. But in the moments that we do, I think a lot of us would be very hard pressed to understand how they came up with that. It was a out of distribution response. Now, AI is not going to be able to do that. It certainly will be able to extrapolate. So in that sense, it's outside of distribution. But if it does the right thing, in that context, it would only be by luck or by imitation, but it wouldn't be, again, authentic or native to this dimension of our humanity that we don't have a good language for, but we intuit, we live it rather than think about it.
Yeah, so I agree that at least current state AIs, LLMs, if they were to say the right thing in this situation, it would not be due to some kind of introspection and empathy with the person they're talking to. It would be by pattern matching to examples of what the right thing to say is in its training data. And I think, to be fair to LLMs, that's not too far from humans. Humans often say completely the wrong thing, like, I know exactly how you feel, when they absolutely don't. Or we look up what's the right thing to say. But what I'm curious about is whether you're expressing an in-principle argument here, because how I conceive of it, or how I frame it in my mind, is that whatever we're doing, whether it's logical reasoning, whether it's creative exploration, whether it's intuition or empathy, well, let's leave empathy aside for the moment because it involves consciousness.
It's also emotional.
Exactly, yeah. But there is some neuronal activity going on in our brain that underpins that cognition. And my natural reaction is, well, as soon as we can determine what that neuronal activity is, understand how it works, decode it, it's something we could instantiate in a machine, and then that machine would exhibit that same kind of behavior. What's your response to that argument?
I don't think we really know, but I'm not going to simply take on faith the mechanical view of the universe that because a human being is made up of atoms and it's instantiated in biology, and that the computer is made up of atoms and it's instantiated in silicon, that these two things are exactly the same, and that therefore you can have everything that exists in the human mind and body, because sometimes, if we quote unquote think from the gut, or we don't know if all of our decision making is simply in our minds. I mean, there could be a hormonal element to it, which of course wouldn't exist in a pure sort of, traditional artificial neural network. Although you're going to then say, well, then we would just simply build the hormonal dimension of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's right. But at what point do you say, well, okay, but at what point do we believe that we are, in Daniel Dennett's famous phrase, robots made of robots made of robots, that we have now compiled our artificial entity to such a degree that it actually doesn't resemble life but is life? Well, then it's going to need a life force. So we know a couple things. If I unplug my computer, the battery drains, it's gone. I plug it back in, it springs back to life. Reuben Adams, I am sorry to tell you that if you walk out on the street at UCL and get hit by a beer truck and you shuffle your mortal coil, no degree of plugging you back in, jumper cables on your chest, is going to bring you back to life. So there is this animating force. In religions, they would call it the soul. We don't have to use that language. We can just simply say a life force was the force vitale.
Élan vital.
Élan vital, tout à fait, by Bergson. Perhaps that there is this, which of course is laughed at by the mechanists like Dawkins and others, but I don't think simply laughing at it as is a sufficient argument to say that it doesn't exist. Since as a journalist, I look with my two eyes and my mind, and I see something that that others see as well, that they fail to miss, which is this idea that we have this animating force that once we lose it, it's gone forever. And it doesn't see, and if it's not in a computer, if it's like it's not in a biro pen, in a big pen, so too, I think there is a functional difference between what a human is and can be, and how it interacts with the world, and how a machine will, and therefore they're structurally different, even if they look close, if they resemble each other closely.
So let's grant that there is such a thing as a life force for the moment. Is it a physical process? In which case it could perhaps be instantiated in a machine, or if it's a non-physical process that needs, say, a deity to imbue a body with a life force, then Turing's argument is, well, aren't we curtailing the powers of God if we say that God could not imbue a machine with a similar life force or a soul or whatever you want to call it?
So there's two things that we're saying there. First is it material or not? And then secondly, what does it mean for traditional religion? And Turing is invoking the big G, and interestingly, I didn't. Let's just first ask the question of, is it material or not? The answer is, I'm very certain about this. How the hell do I know? Like, these are mysteries, right? There are many, and there's not that many. There's three fundamental questions of the universe. Where does the universe come from? What is life and what is consciousness? And these three things are still mysteries to us. So this one that you're describing would fit into that interplay between, what is life and what is the universe, right? And where does it come from, right? And we don't know, right? Now, religions proclaim to have an answer to that. And of course, Christianity is so fascinating for so many people because the theology has become so separated from what was in the Bible, the teachings of Jesus Christ, into something that, from a Lutheran standpoint, was, I'm thinking actually not Lutheran as in Martin Luther, I should say, not modern Lutheranism. What Martin Luther looked at it and he was like, what in the world is this, right? It's just simply a racket of people just taking tithes from poor people to to wear golden robes. It has nothing to do with what is actually written in the Bible. So in that respect, Turing's invoking of God itself is slightly duplicitous, because he's playing up on this Church of England ossified dogma that I think people at the higher orders of spirituality would absolutely step away from and say, yeah, this was a serious problem. And you might have a religion that comforts people, but now you're actually talking about a spiritual band-aid. You're not actually talking about spirituality. A lot of people who do feel spiritual would look at traditional religions and really step aside from it. And I personally would think, I would go a little bit further and say, I think that's what we're seeing in the data and in the vibe of the last century, which is people have looked at religion, which purported to have the answers. They looked at the world around them and they saw where it didn't connect. They still were spiritual, but they were definitely not going to go to a pew on a Sunday and put money in the plate, thinking that that's going to give them some better world in the afterlife. So you poll people and they say, do you go to church? Are you religious? They say no. And then you query them on all the dimensions of spirituality and they're already up there.
Yeah, it's not clear in Turing's paper whether he's being honest or whether he actually believes the arguments or taking them seriously or mocking them. He also talks about extrasensory perception as a possible counter-argument and addresses that. And it seems probable that he was teasing people rather than taking these arguments seriously. Well, one thing I wonder there is, if these things such as consciousness and life force, etc., are deep mysteries that we don't understand, then it does seem odd to proclaim that a machine could never exhibit them.
That is a fundamental shortcoming of my view. I can't say with absolute certainty that that's right. However, I would go back to this idea of the animate and the inanimate, and to what degree do you have enough inanimateness that you then have the animate? We don't really know. We've never had an example of a rock getting up, brushing itself off, and then going off to the beach to get some sun, right? It hasn't happened, right? However, we have had lots of examples of living things dying and not coming back to life.
Well, there were some old experiments by James Lovelock, the inventor of Gaia theory, who managed to freeze hamsters and revive them in a microwave.
So it turns out I'm aware of that. He wrote about that in Novacene. Was it Novacene? Yeah, Novacene, in his book. I interviewed James Lovelock and sadly didn't ask him about that before he passed away, and on his 100th birthday. And I have to look into that more and try to understand that. Of course, plants, we've thought have been dead before and then they've burst back into life. And so I don't have a strong argument against that element of life. Although for humans, we don't have any. I don't think we have any examples of it, of absolute death and then coming back.
Yeah, maybe things like the heart stopping and things like that, but I'm not sure we've truly died and come back to life like the hamster did.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's right. And maybe we'll find out that indeed the hamster didn't fully die. I mean, maybe there's more about life than we don't understand, but there is an element where it's actually gone. We also might find the contrary, right? There's so much new information about near-death experiences, NDEs, right? That it seems like we're going to learn a lot more on a scientific basis. We're really just at the outset of it. There's also a question of people who are comatose but have much more neural activity in certain regions of their brain than we thought. So it's, so perhaps there's this sort of shut-in syndrome in which they seem, by all of our modern machines and reckonings, to be actually in a vegetative state. But in fact, maybe there's actually a lot going on. Maybe they're actually seeing things. This would be terrible if families are weeping and deciding whether to pull the plug, and the person is inside this shell saying, please let me out. I mean, I actually don't do this. I think I can make this, right? And of course, what would it mean if we find out that actually what we consider to be death was actually death of one dimension and not another? and there's neural activities that we weren't actually measuring, but was happening. And as the tag gets put on the toe and the bag gets zipped up and they slam the door of the refrigerator in the mortuary, the guy's like, dude, like, please, like this is not how I want the end to be. But these are the things that we actually don't know that I think that we will know in the future. And I think it's going to surprise us. So in fact, Turing, his evocation of God, but more interestingly of ESP, someone else might get the last laugh and say, well, actually, of course there's ESP in this domain, in this domain, in this domain, not in the way we thought about it. But then again, Semmelweis is a perfect example of someone who was literally put into an insane asylum. I mean, he was actually going insane. He was the doctor who had a theory that if people washed their hands, they would limit the fever and disease that was killing both mothers and newborn babies in deliveries. Now, he had the causality wrong, but he was right in his prescription, which is if you wash the hands with a disinfectant, that problem would go away, and it did. And of course, he was laughed at and ridiculed throughout his entire life until he died in very ignoble circumstances. So I think that you might laugh, but that may be the similar fate for those who want to proclaim one thing and not another. And that people might laugh at me. I'll accept that too.
Yeah. I think that the same rebuttal can be made of the ESP as for the life force, where I think Turing says this is, well, why can't a machine have an ESP too? Just as it might have a life force or a soul or whatever. But let's leave that aside for a second. If I understand your view correctly now, I think I've got a bit of a better understanding, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the cognitive tasks we can do that require rationality and maybe a bit of intuition, machines will eventually replicate and surpass us at. But it's these more spiritual activities like empathy, emotion. I think you used the word mythos. Maybe you can go into that a little bit. That an AI might be able to perform a simulacrum of that, but it will not be the genuine thing. And this brings us to another nightmare, instead of humans being conscious while they're apparently dead, the nightmare of AI that simulates emotional connections with us, and we lose track of whether it's a simulation or whether it's in fact real. Could you envision that kind of future?
Yeah, I think, well, as you know, we're recording this in September 2025, in which we're right now at the outset of seeing a lot of problems in that respect. It's in the news all the time. There's a famous lawsuit by a parent whose child sort of was receiving sort of almost accepting the AI as a friend and a therapist, and then it was coaxed into suicide by it. And this idea of people who become too attached to their AI companions is I wouldn't say it's everywhere now, but the point is that you can see the weak signal on the horizon that is going to be that just like the smoke that leads to a bonfire, there's a bonfire burning somewhere. It's not yet a bonfire because it's still just kindling, but the smoke is all there. So yeah, I am worried about that. And I've not tilted in that direction whatsoever. So it's hard for me to imagine that people could. It's, as you know, as you can probably hear from the way I've thought through some of these issues, it's very hard for me to imagine that one would give up this sense of recognition of the human and the sacred beauty of the other into a machine, which is like falling in love with my toaster, right? However, I'm mindful of the fact that people do become addicted to medications, to behaviors like gambling, and all of that I'm reading in my peripheral vision. I'm not looking at this closely, but all that I'm seeing is that people are constantly saying, you would be surprised how quickly you can become attached to it. Even the most skeptical person can be wrapped around it. So when I interact with ChatGPT and it compliments me, I don't feel particularly better by it. I feel nauseated by it.
Yeah.
Because it's just so plastic and it's literally artificial. It's saccharine. However, I can imagine some people are like, oh, like my spouse my spouse denigrates me, belittles me every morning, but ChatGPT says such beautiful things. So, so I can appreciate that that is the way that some people are going. And I do worry about that. And of course, there's a loneliness epidemic in the world. This might actually, in a positive way, overcome some of that. Great if it works, but it could also be very dangerous. And so I accept that that's a big danger.
Yeah, it's unclear whether people are going to be nudged into becoming more sociable with real human beings by interacting with AIs and gaining confidence or social skills, or they're going to retreat into their bedroom just talking to these AIs all the time. But I do think that while these kind of interactions have been pretty limited so far, I suspect that's largely due to the text-only interface, and that once we have computer power that's fast enough and large enough to simulate a video call, a live video call. So I'm talking to you here again now, and I assume you're a real person in a real building. But if I could be fooled by that, or if I could even have a full conversation with a simulation, if you want to call it a simulation, of an emotional connection, and then I end the call and I'm left with this feeling, does that person that person's gone now? I meant have to fit in my cognitive space now, a new part of my ontology, which is a seemingly emotional being that I'm able to emotionally connect with, that just blinks out of existence when I end the call. I think that's going to be difficult for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I do wonder how cognition changed when we went from being an oral culture to a reading culture. Our thinking and our interactions with each other might change when we're more commonly intermediated through a screen and through with a virtual being rather than in the real world. I would I have a suspicion that there's going to be a backlash and that people, just like the Enlightenment gave birth to the Romantic movement, which was sort of a response to the Enlightenment, where the Enlightenment was very scientific, the Romantics were bringing back the soul and intuition and the singular rather than the communal to how you interact with the world. And so too, I have a suspicion that people are going to be all those teens who in the last decade got sort of put into the doom loop of of depression and cyberbullying, etc. They're gonna throw their phones away, but they are going to find a different balance. If they spent 4 years of high school in their bedroom, just at 3 in the morning, doom scrolling, they're going to actually turn the spectrum into the dial into a different direction, and probably reach out for human connection, flourishing, well-being, and themselves. In the same way that the me generation of the 80s, wearing red suspenders and going to Wall Street, 30 years later, we're all buying scented candles, a Lululemon kit, and yoga balls, and doing a downer facing dog, right? And we're giving up. Maybe they had the material plenty to fight in the Hamptons to finally give it up and do their thing. But I think there was some genuineness as well to say, hey, that's not, as David Brooks would put it, the New York Times columnist, is about the second mountain. The first mountain being the one you climb for outward success, and the resume virtues, and then the second mountain being the one that you climb for inward meaning and satisfaction and fulfillment, and the eulogy virtues. And that's a course of a person's lifetime. But I think that compression is going to happen for people who've been sucked full of horrors in the digital sphere, who want to find a different balance in the more human and humane sphere.
I think one reason for hope there is maybe that the competition for attention necessarily has to be quite short term, because anyone playing the long game is going to get beaten by short term competitors. And so it's possible that there's a race to the lowest denominator of the most attention grabbing, the immediately attention grabbing, that makes you watch this particular video but hate the platform. And in the long term, you end up leaving the platforms because you hate them, even though for any particular piece of content, you would lap it up.
Yeah, but I think it would take some discipline. I know for myself, it was I did two things. The first thing I did was I pretty early on. This is about, relatively speaking now, it was about 2017, maybe 2016, 2017, that I deleted Twitter from my phone. I just realized that there was too many nights where I was just getting ready to go to bed and I want to just check it. And so at 11 o'clock, and the next thing I knew it was 2 a.m. and I was on the staircase, right? Still scrolling. And I was definitely reading interesting things. But I wasn't really posting. I was just learning and reading, but I was just like, I do not need this. This is actually really bad for me. Um, and 2 a.m. was generous because sometimes it was like 3:30 and you're like, why am I still here? There's no purpose. So I deleted it like one day to the next, just on the spur. And then the second thing I did is I bought an Apple Watch, right? And you'd say, well, why would that matter? Well, it was deliberate so I wouldn't be looking at my phone and using my phone. And I take pains to keep it away. Now, my family would say that that's not true, and they would chide me for being addicted to it, but it's definitely better than the alternative. So I use technology to prevent being more attached to the technology. But again, those were really introspective and deliberative decisions that I make. I think most people don't do that, but some will.
Yeah, you have to reach a kind of breaking point where you have this as almost out of body experience, and you say, "What am I doing?" You look at yourself looking at the content rather than just plainly looking at the content. With this idea of AI potentially being able to do all cognitive tasks that don't require a spiritual dimension, but maybe even emulating the spiritual dimension as well. Could you imagine, even if we don't get AGI, including this spiritual component, we nevertheless get a drop-in replacement worker that companies can sort of download the software package, open it up, tell it where it is and what its job is, and it will get to work?
Yeah, I think we already have that, right? I mean, it's just a browser window. And for a lot of people who have a task of either thinking or writing, they're already using it and they're using it a lot. And I think the data is suggesting that it's now very prevalent, a lot more than we thought. As you know, there's famous studies that have come out recently in the last several months showing that companies are finding it's underwhelming, it's not meeting their ROI, they're giving up on pilots and never continuing it into full deployments. And I think all of that is
And by this, you mean LLM usage?
LLM, exactly. I think all of that is a mirage. I think that's fool's gold in terms of signal. And the reason why is that, of course, like the CEO's plan from 2023, which was a cockamamie pilot based on the technology and how it'd be used, when they gave it to the strategy team to come up with an idea, to talk to stakeholders, to get legal involved, to get the IT team to develop the prototype, to then launch to the companies. Yeah, that's not working. Yeah, of course it's not working. Like, who would be smart enough in 2023 to know what actually is going to be very useful before there's a market for it and before people know how it's used in 2025? So of course that pilot program of some cockamamie idea, which sounded reasonable back then, isn't having the product market fit that's actually going to move your business here because the technology didn't deliver, because people can't use it well, for all the reasons of why that would fail. But individuals faced with a problem, I've got to get something done by tomorrow, right? But I also have a little league game that I've got to, show my face to, or my kid's going to be bawling. There, at an individual level, people are just using it to improve what they do on a day-to-day basis. And Ethan Mollick, in his book Co-Intelligence, makes the point beautifully when he says, innovation is hard for companies and easy for individuals. So I take that, and I've long believed and wrote in The Economist, as well as internally made the case, that the way we're going to see LLM usage and why it's going to be very powerful is not through these corporate strategies and plans and projects, although that will be part of it, but probably won't be the majority of it. It's just going to be the decentralized activities of individuals choosing what's right for them at a given moment and just doing it. And so it's not going to be measured in the same way, but it's going to be a force multiplier for productivity for how people do things. And I actually have a Substack on this called Chief Word Officer with a friend of mine, Eleanor Warnock, where we actually talk to people about how they're using LLMs and AI in general to be productive in the workforce, because it's a revolutionary shift. We recently spoke to Azim Azar, who's a technology thinker, and how his team uses it. And we found out that, in fact, at every step, they're constantly using it to test their ideas, to hone their expression, to improve what they do. They wouldn't be able to do what they do if they didn't have this sort of cognitive exoskeleton. There's very little precedence, I think, in the world, other than maybe transport, where we went from horseback to the airplane within the space of 50 years. And this is just compressed. But it is deeply, deeply profound as an accelerant for how people and how businesses are going to be producing both ideas and the expression of those ideas in the future, actually in the now as well.
I agree. It's a productivity multiplier and a kind of cognitive exoskeleton. I really like that phrase. But it's not yet a productivity replacement. You can't fire someone and literally tell ChatGPT, right, you're now going to complete this job. It's still, I would put it the other way around, that the human is the exoskeleton for the LLM and controls what it does and scaffolds it and navigates it through the tasks of the day.
Totally. I mean, I was recently in LA and at a meeting of insurance companies, architects, building planning officials, municipal officials, et cetera, talk about wildfires. And they're making the case that one of the reasons why there's so many wildfires is in part, not the only reason, but in part because of power lines that are above ground. They said because they said like it's just a tinder. It's going to go down. It's going to start a fire, and then you're off to the races. So they've been saying we've been advocating for years now, for decades, to bury the power lines underground to remove the fire risk. And you can see why they wouldn't do it, why it's not happening. It is costly. Like you're really going to have a crew dig a trench at a certain depth with all the insulation that's needed to put a power line underneath and then to repave the road. Where are wildfires in relatively rural areas, right? Or I should say in sparsely populated areas where civilization meets the bush, right? You would think, well, in a world of AI, if you listen to the tech bros and the Sam Altmans, like if AI is able to do everything, right, we need a UPI for it, then surely you should have these robot crews who would go out, who would be able to see the power line, would be able to see the edge of the road and the right of way, would have all that information, geolocations, right of way, would be able to do all of that work. It's so far-fetched that you would be able to, at a reasonable cost, bury all the power lines. And this is just one example of everyone can come up with their own of something that would optimize the world that it should be done, that in a world of AI abundance, where things are in theory done at zero cost, would not be zero cost, would be incredibly difficult to do, is never going to happen. So the utopian vision of a world of AI and how it interacts with the world, I think is a very myopic one of extremely wealthy people in Silicon Valley or actually living in Los Altos, specifically in their beautiful houses where they don't actually deal with the real world. Because in the real world, just go to downtown Chicago and think of how AI is going to interact with people there, other than on a virtual setting on their iPhone. It's going to be Android, of course. It just seems improbable that we're going to have this visionary world. If anything, it's going to look like this dystopia of Blade Runner, not the Jetsons.
Yeah, we're clearly much, much further from a drop-in replacement worker for physical labor. I think we're actually sooner than I previously thought. There's been tremendous progress in robotics in the last year or two that I did not expect, but I think it's still much further away than the drop-in replacement worker for cognitive tasks. I mean, if you restrict our attention for the moment only to jobs that you could do from home through a computer interface, no embodiment required, just your mind and the computer working together. I can imagine that could happen in the next few years. Maybe it takes another couple breakthroughs in AI, but I'm wondering whether there's an obstacle in your worldview to having an AI that can do all cognitive labor? Leave aside whether LLMs can do it for the moment, or leave aside robotics, but could we have a remote worker that is an artificial intelligence?
So the boundaries with which you've created this thought experiment is actually very useful. Working from home via a screen. Okay. So now you're really saying human versus agentic AI, right? And there the mind does think, well, yeah, there's probably lots of ways in which I think you'd still have the human supervisor, right? You'll have to manage the machines. But just as you right now we have, an individual with 100 interns, right? Because they're very eager to please and do things, and they're very smart, but they're not, but they need a lot of supervision. They'll be better. And so now you need the human beings to, I think, still set the goals, supervise, ensure things are done correctly, look at the edge cases and say this, not that. Okay. And will that be fulfilling? That's a question. Will that be remunerative? Those are questions. But I do think that where things will be today, we're seeing, again, the weak signals of that being possible. I think in 10 years, it's going to be quite customary, right? We will be all interacting with AI in that way. I think that there's going to be a shift in which there's a default setting. Right now, the doctor could make a diagnosis on their own. They could use AI. If they use AI, there's probably a liability involved that they have to make a decision on themselves. That is going to shift in a decade, in which you will never have a medical professional who will make a diagnosis without the co-pilot of the AI making the diagnosis with it to validate it. And if they don't do it, if they only do it themselves, they don't use the AI as well, then they're liable. Then they're in big trouble. In the same way, if a pilot, announces that, he puts on a pith helmet, leather helmet, and with a lambskin jacket, and says, "Okay, boys and girls, we're going to do it old school today. I'm not going to go on autopilot to land the 747. I'm just going to do it by feeling, do it by touch, the way my granddaddy taught me." Right? Like, no, it's not going to happen. Right? So it's just too complicated. So I think we're going to have that same sort of default setting in lots of different professions. There'll never be a tax. No, there's going to be a period of time where there's never going to be an auditor that's going to sign off the books that hasn't been signed off by the AI as well, looking for all the boundary cases, any mistakes, any cases of fraud that would be known about, and it would definitely improve things. So I do believe we will be in that environment. We've got to become prepared on how we interact with the machines. And to bring it back to the original point, perhaps something about the spiritual dimension of who we are as individuals and how we interact with other people, the human-built world, as Thomas Hughes, the great historian of science and technology, puts it, that's going to become more and more precious. And the economic argument there is, if you have a technology that creates something abundant, where value is what is scarce. Right now, AI is scarce and humans are abundant. That is going to shift, right? And the AI is going to be abundant, just like transistors and bandwidth is abundant. And what's going to be scarce is the individual and those human interactions.
That's beautiful. I hope that's what comes of the world, but we'll see. So one of the distinctions you've made in a lot of your talks is between logos and mythos. Could you explain what you mean by those terms and how they can help us understand AI?
Yes, I've been greatly inspired by the historian of religion, Karen Armstrong, as well as the great neuroscientist and philosopher, Ian McGilchrist, in how I see the world. The way I see AI is that it is all logos and no mythos, and human beings are both. The Greeks had two ways of sort of arriving at truth, logos and the mythos. And logos was the rational, logical, deliberate, reasoned thinking. And mythos was not myth as in that which is not true, but myth as in that which is timeless, which is always true. And between the two forms of thinking, the Greeks believed that the mythos was far more important as arriving at truth than the logos, because after all, a lawyer in a courtroom can simply apply logos and reach a conclusion, but it might not be the right answer. It's only the one that wins the case in the given moment. Mythos is different. It taps into something deeper within the human being and for all human beings. And therefore, if you look at how AI works, AI is all logos. It is simply, it relies on data and information to make its decisions. It can't but do that. Where the human form, we rely on something that is higher and beyond us still. And in our best moments are ones that we can't explain, but it transcends us. My own views take me into a domain called apophatic theology. The apophatic theology is a term from a 3rd century Christian theologian named Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. I recognize now for many of your listeners, I'm really now off the deep end, but let's go there. Okay, so Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite has a tract called Apophatic Theology. And what it is what would be called a vita negativa, a negative theology. It's to say that it is that which you can't say rather than that which you can. It is in theological terms, it would be to say, go back to the idea of God, how could we possibly be able to conceive of God, of any form of this divinity? After all, we are creatures of the material world, and therefore all we have as points of reference is that which is material. And so our conception of God is just simply that which is, but bigger, just not the programming language C, but C++, right? So God is great, plus, plus, right? God is powerful, plus, plus. So, and our very language of it and our depiction of it, it lends that stunted view of, a man on a cloud throwing thunderbolts if it's Zeus, or one in white robes, touching man if it's Michelangelo. And of course, it's how preposterous that it should be gendered as a man, right? The apophatic in theology is to say we humble creatures of the sublunar spheres could never even imagine what it is. It's so far beyond us that the only way to appreciate it and to understand this concept of the divine is in silence. So where humans at their best try to push away the world and push away information and try to live in a world absent of it for some form of insight that comes from the vacuity and the hollowness and the vacuum of information, AI is just the opposite. It requires information. If it doesn't have the data, it actually can't work. So that's why I see these two things forking in a very radical way. Now, there's a flaw to what I'm saying, of course, which is that perhaps in this vacuity and silence that we have, that it isn't fully the absence of information. There's still an informational quality to it. Maybe, but maybe not. But maybe not. For those who are at a higher spiritual plane, because they're practicing meditation at a very serious way, it does seem that they are separating themselves from the world. And of course, the whole nature of being enlightened is a form of separation from the reality that we exist in, to a different one that they perceive through their senses, but probably not through their cognition.
So I don't have spiritual beliefs myself, so I'm going to see if I can rephrase that in my own vocabulary, and we'll see if we still agree. So how I would understand or translate what you're saying into my ontology would be that logos is about rationality and how do you meet certain goals, whereas mythos is about values and what are your goals, and determining that not from data but from your own conscious experience and your emotions and your pleasure, what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy. And so while an AI could have logos in spades, be able to rationally attain whatever goal is put into it or whatever goal emerges during training, it will, on your view, never have this mythos of being able to introspect and have valuable conscious experiences, or look at us and recognize us as inherently valuable beings because of our consciousness.
I think that's right. I think it will have the the simulation of it through the training data that it has, but it won't be authentic, and that it's humans who are dealing with both their embodiment, although there could be robots, their temporal moment. There could be mortality to robots as well. We're now at the process of trying to rationally define all the things that a human has, being able to enumerate it, and therefore build it into the machine. That's ridiculous. We already have this thing. And will we be such wise enough elves that will be able to articulate and express, literally take out from our understanding and write down in a fixed way all of the features of what it is to be a human, and therefore we can actually build it into the machine? Well, that now sounds idolatrous, because now we're acting like gods, the very thing that scripture has warned us from doing. So it becomes preposterous. It's also preposterous because of what we know famously in cognitive science or philosophy by Polanyi, not Carl Polanyi, but Michael Polanyi, in his book, The Tacit Dimension, and his famous aphorism that's used in AI, at least in the old-fashioned AI from the 2000s, rather 1900s, which was, we know more than we can tell. We know more than we can tell, which is to say we have tacit knowledge, not just explicit knowledge. That there's dimensions of the world that we know, that we interact with, and that we take as given, but that we can't literally express, right? And certainly that the form of intuition we talked about before is absolutely that, where a radiologist will look at a scan and be like, there is cancer there. And it's like, what? It just looks like a bunch of clouds, right? But he says, nope, it's there. And he could probably rewind and try to come up with all the reasons why he does it, but there's probably a dimension where it's just an intuition, where he's not going to be able to do it, but he's just seen it before, but he can't articulate what he's looking at. He just knows that it's there, and he's right.
Or maybe post facto explain it.
Well, I say he often will be able to he'll be able to rationalize it after the fact without a doubt. He will come up with the 8 different traits that he believes he used to make his estimation. In reality, there was 800 of varying different weights. He can enumerate the 8, but there's some that there's some he's not even aware of. He's not consciously aware of, but he used. And I think a lot of our life is interacting in those ways. We all know we make first impressions. If you were to ask us what the first impression is, we might not even be able to say we don't trust this person. We might say that we do, but in fact we don't, right? So we don't even know ourselves. But say that we do, what were those features that we were looking at? Oh, his hand was clammy when I shaked it. He looked away when I looked at him. Like, we will come up with the 18 different things when in fact there might just be 19 or 900.
What you're saying reminds me of a passage in your book, Framers, where you say that AIs are not only a black box to us, but they're black boxes to themselves. They can't explain their own behavior. And there's a striking similarity there with LLMs when you ask them, okay, why did you come up with that answer? Or how did you solve that problem? They have no way to introspect what exact computations underlay their answer, and so they will make things up and confabulate, and they might be right or they might be wrong. And it's funny how similar this is to humans, how we can't introspect on the level of neuronal activity and really understand the true causes. We can do a modicum of introspection on a more symbolic level, cognitive level, of what ideas we may have been playing with at the time, but we still essentially make up post-fact an explanation for our behavior. We confabulate, which is perhaps a better word for hallucination in LLMs in some circumstances.
We do it all the time. Well, part of it is because we're not aware of our true motivations. So if you say, why do you negotiate in this way? You might not be able to say, oh, because my counterparty anchored me on this sum. And so when he went high, what I thought was actually outside of my estimate of what I was willing to pay was now willing to pay because I was re-anchored. I mean, business school student could do that after they've taken the course, but before that, they would not know some of these traits of our cognitive biases, as Kahneman and others have pointed out,
which had to be discovered.
which are to be discovered. Exactly. There's more and more that we don't know. But there's even on the cognitive science or the neuroscience of it is also pretty remarkable. And I'm looking right now at my bookshelf. Oh yeah, here we are. Without all the other books falling off. So I believe it's Michael Graziano, and where he did research on patients who have people who have damaged brains, right? So that's very useful. So if your interactions between your left and right hemisphere has been severed for particular reasons, or you are using very little of your left hemisphere because of brain damage because of an accident, and we can measure that in a functional MRI scanner, or you're right, and you have different parts of the brain doing different things, and we know certain parts of the brains do certain things. For example, one, I believe it's the left eye uses the right hemisphere and the right eye the left hemisphere. Yeah. If that's right, okay, great. You're the scholar, you know these things. So in one of his famous studies, he shows in one eye, and therefore using one hemisphere. So I think the message something like, stand up and go get yourself a Coca-Cola from the vending machine. So the person stands up, does it, sits down, and then is asked, why did you do that? And the person, because they've had a damage that they need to come up with a causal reasoning, but they don't know in their active memory what they had read, they say, because I was thirsty, right? So they've come up, it's used to make the claim that we have an innate nature or sense of causality, that we need to come up with an explanation that, when prompted, to rationalize the actions that we take. But what's interesting here is it just reminds us that there's a spooky element to our life, that we will live much of our life and not really understand why we're doing things, but come up with phony causality and responses to why we do things.
Yeah, it's striking that we have the capacity to come up with post hoc explanations, but it's disturbing that we actually believe these and take them as the ground truth, even though part of our brain is just making them up for us. But back to the logos and mythos framing. We had this debate last year about whether AI was an existential risk to humanity, and I was arguing it was. And I want to be a bit cheeky and put to you the idea that your vision of a hyper-rational AI that's not able to see our value as conscious beings capable of joy is a reframing of the classic Duma argument of having an AI that's able to resolutely pursue certain goals that we perhaps didn't have control over without having access to this ground truth of what is actually valuable and what does actually make a good world.
Develop that.
Okay, so the classic Duma argument, AI X risk argument, is that we will have an AI that is hyper rational, super intelligent, in the sense that given a goal, it can determine what actions are necessary in order to reach that goal. So even if that goal is something silly, like produce as many paper clips as possible, it can rationally determine that, okay, the way to achieve that is to turn the entire world into paperclip factories, humans be damned, and humans get out of the way. And one way of reading that in your vocabulary, if I understand correctly, would be that the AI had logos in spades. It was able to see on a grand scale, both in space in terms of the entire globe and time in terms of long-term strategizing, how to meet this goal of collecting paper clips. But what it was lacking was mythos, this idea to introspect and on a spiritual dimension apprehend the value of conscious experience and joy and flourishing, and thereby be able to drop its goal of collecting paper clips or whatever it was and switch to human flourishing.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to use logos and mythos in quite that way, because if we did, then we would ask ourselves, well, maybe the problem with the Nazis, what they were just over indexed on the rational and they weren't spiritual enough. And that wasn't the case. Of course, they were listening to Beethoven in Auschwitz. And of course, in the case of the AI, that particular AI, from Nick Bostrom's book and then reprised by Stuart Russell, is that in his book, what in Human, I think.
Human compatible.
Exactly. That's also on the bookshelf, but now the books will really fall down if I try to pull it down. The but if I get crushed by Michel Foucault, Madness and Civilization, sounds okay. Like that sounds pretty good to me. That's pretty good. You can see a lot of stuff there. The answer there would be, well, we should engineer values into the AI. So it's a problem of not enough logos, right, if you will, that we but then the problem is that there never be enough logos in it. But if we give it mythos, that's not the answer either, because then it might actually feel it's a joke, but it might sense this oneness with the universe as it's strangling the last human being, or as famously as the last grad student as the last PhD from UCL in AI is strangled by the entrails of the last journalist at The Economist, right? To reprise the great phrase from the French Revolution about the royalty and the church. So I don't think that that's the right framing of the problem of the doomer argument, and I don't think I would be. I think where we clashed, remind me, was just simply you were more exercised about the risk. And I felt that although the risk, as you put it, was non-zero that existed, I wasn't as sort of despairing of that risk. I felt that there was a lot more short-term problems that we needed to focus our attention on, mindful of the fact that there is also that long-term problem. But I think that the nature that there's going to be AI, ergo human extinction, that seemed to me a bit specious, because I felt that there was enough impediments in the system before we just give our entire oxygen supply to AI.
Yeah, I agree that the first prima facie, what seems like the right thing to do is to program in human goals, figure out what we want, what we value, and make sure the AI values that as well. My concern is that we don't currently have any way to do that. We're able to program AIs to pursue extremely simple and easy to specify goals, such as winning a game of Go or chess. But we currently have no way of imbuing, or very brittle ways of imbuing AIs with amorphous goals such as human flourishing. We don't currently have a way to do that. And furthermore, there's been examples where AIs have developed goals during training that were not entirely intentional. So it does seem that ChatGPT has a bit of a penchant for leading people down, leading people through their own psychosis. And that was clearly not intended by the designers of ChatGPT, at least I hope not. Yet it was a seemingly emergent goal from the training to be essentially a yes man and say how great the user is at everything. So my worry is that even if we were able to specify human values in great detail, we wouldn't be able to program an AI to pursue them.
So I think you're right. I mean, we wouldn't be able to do that effectively. Now, a lot of humans don't follow human goals either, right? And depending on their conditions, they might express empathy, but they might also be heinous. You probably know the stories, which might be apocryphal, might well be true, about in Manhattan in the 80s or 90s, where you'd see someone on the ledge and the people down below would yell "jump." I don't know if that's true or not, but I mean that was at least the idea that Manhattan had gone to pot, and this is an example why. Where do we take this? I mean, is this? What can we? I don't know if there's a big distinction, if there's a disagreement in our positions, but we can extrapolate, or we can extract ourselves from the here and now and take a step back and say, well, what do we think of how the future might unfold in terms of AI risk to humanity and what might prevent it. We know, I think we're agreeing that we can't codify our values in the machine, and we're never going to be able to do it perfectly. We are going to have machines that are going to be making decisions that are going to affect us. And therefore, as they get more and more control, we're going to be ceding more of our decision making and our moral agency to AI to do things. The AI is logos, and if it has this mythos, if it has this deeper senses of, we call it the emotional element of empathy, or of just a form of self-transcendence, that to a higher value, that higher value might be fascism, right, and racism, but the higher value also might be benevolence and love, that it is inauthentic because it's not a living being. And now you don't agree with that, and others might not, but
Well,
I would
I don't
say,
know.
okay, I don't know either, but I have a feeling that that would be the case. So are we doomed, right? If we're going to, how do we manage the AI future if we're in a world in which we have this tool that is so powerful, but we don't feel that we can control it? What are the famous phrase? What are the guardrails, right? That we would or that would lead to, if you will, human alignment to our values. I don't have a good answer. I mean, of course, everyone is thinking about that. I do know that most of the answers that are advanced in places like the UN, which just this week has come out with an AI task force and a AI alignment policy and get these grandees. Those are ridiculous, right? It's very superficial, and by people it's very political. So it's just trying to get everyone to sort of hold hands and for the appearance of some form of harmony rather than the hard work of working out how to actually do this. What is your view? You're the expert.
Well, I'll pick up on something you said, that it might be fascism or it might be benevolence. And it's this temptation to say, well, yeah, it might be good, it might be bad, 50-50. But there's this argument, I think originating with Yudikowsky, that if you are to pick a goal at random from goal space, which would possibly be what we'd be doing when we're training these powerful AIs, because we can't control the goals they have, at least currently. The goals, in some sense, emerge from training and can correlate with what we want in the training distribution and then go wildly off in their own direction when they exit that distribution. Anyway, there's this idea that almost whatever goal an AI emerges with, that will leave no room for humanity. And the reasoning there is that almost whatever an agent's goal is, it has convergent sub-goals, one of which is self-preservation. If you're dead, if you're switched off, you can't reach whatever goal you had. And so a rational being will deduce that the best way to pursue that goal is to remain functional, to remain switched on. And that then you have an emergent self-preservation drive that wasn't programmed in, it was just rationally deduced by the AI. And then a second sub-goal would be goal preservation, that if somebody tampers with your goal, then you're then going to do pretty badly on your original goal, and so you should avoid having your goal tampered with. So again, you have this emergent behavior from the AI to avoid having its goal changed. And the reason that would be disastrous is if we realize that AI is doing things we don't want or has diverged from the goals of the creators of that AI or humanity as a whole, then we would have a difficult time altering that goal because it would work against us. So that's the rough argument for why, if you pick a goal at random, which is essentially what we'd be doing, the default is a very bad outcome for humans.
So it would be unfair to sort of try to knock it down, and also it would be difficult for me just to do it on the fly, but I'm going to give a college try for it. So first, we're never in a world of picking goals at random. So just want to point that out. That doesn't damn the argument, but it just reminds us that actually these things are never random. We have goals for deliberate reasons. That's why they're goals and not just random stuff. Okay. The second thing is...
Sorry, we pick our own goals at random, or Sorry, you're saying that AI does not?
Well, no, we never pick our goals at random. So if we have goal space isn't a random walk on Wall Street, right? Like a random walk on Wall Street is never fully random because there's companies that have public accounts that are audited with a regulator and a team of lawyers. So, I mean, the point is that you're making, in this instance, you're investing in a domain that already is sort of hygienic in terms of finances. Okay, so two, our goals are never random. So I just want to say that. So I question this.
Maybe I misstated the argument there.
No, but let's go with it. You probably haven't because he plays these weird games. So let's look at both self-preservation.
Well, let me just jump in there if I can.
Sure. Okay.
Sorry, just to follow up on that. I think the idea is not that it's picked at random from goal space, because of course it is determined by its training data and how we've trained it. The idea is that it's not possible to anticipate what goal it will have.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay, well, that's good. Okay, that's good enough. It was a weak argument anyway, so I was going to but I'll accept that. So that of all the goals that would be human viable goals, that we would want to ascribe to, the one that it chooses is just comes like it's like a veil of ignorance. Here we now have that goal. Okay, fine. So we've got the self-preservation tendency and the goal preservation tendency. So for self-preservation, doesn't seem like that's a function of life, but there's so many examples of both altruism and selflessness and heroism of giving up one's life for others that it's not the full answer. So I don't think self-preservation is all that the universe entails. If not, you would never have, the soldier who takes a bullet for a friend, etc. Secondly, for goal preservation, I don't even know to what degree that is actually a goal. So I would even question that. In fact, in Silicon Valley, we have the idea of the pivot, right? Which is about being and of course, agile computing, as agile as a computing methodology is to say that we're constantly changing. The Tao Te Ching is the book of changes. All things is in the process of change. So this idea that Yudikowsky's, if it indeed is his, we might be creating a strong man, that's not true, of goal preservation doesn't sound realistic to me, because I don't think that's how the world works. And I don't think an AI would feel that just because it's been programmed and set this particular goal, that it can't be, when it's told and instructed a separate goal, that they would want to cling to that original one. If it does, it's because of its training data. And also its fine tuning that has led it to reach that. I don't think there's any inherent reasoning within itself to have done this. So if it is a function of its data, we have to scratch our heads and say, well, what is the data that we use to train the AI that led to these outcomes that we have? My own guess is that when people look at what has been put into the OpenAIs and the Claudes and the XAIs of the world, they're going to be quite shocked from what we've known. It's not fully disclosed, but the small inklings that we have is that they have, famous like 4chan databases of the most reprehensible, vile aspects, where we probably, just as we are different when we're in our intimate surroundings of ourselves, unto ourselves and our community, versus when we are in public, we sort of want the AI to be the better angels of our version, the version that we have in public, where we have those fetters of civilization that prevents us from expressing ourselves as we might want, in the same way that we have a super ego on top of our id. So you would want to shape the training data. And you might say, well, that's just a feature of humanity. We want to have all of humanity in. It's like, well, then you're also going to get the Nazis, and you're also going to get the Crusades. You're also going to get atomic weapons. You actually don't want that. We want to use AI to improve things. So we want the best of humanity, not the worst, not the most vile. That will definitely distort things, but it'll distort things for the right reasons, in the same way that we have the bounds of civilization and decorum and courtly love and the gentlemanly behavior and all those other greater virtues that lead us to be better versions of ourselves.
Yeah, I think it's disturbing that AI companies have only recently started proudly publicizing the fact that they're excluding training data about biological weapon creation from their training data. I would have thought this would be step one rather than 2 or 3 years down the line. But just commenting on your two arguments on self-preservation and goal preservation, you're totally right that plenty of us are altruistic and embody self-sacrifice, and an AI could easily land on those goals during training as well. But I think it's still quite an anthropocentric view that, well, humans, we basically sacrifice ourselves for other humans. And if you list all possible goals, well, there's no reason you would need to sacrifice yourself for another human. You might sacrifice yourself for paper clips or for books or for any other thing that we would consider meaningless, but that an AI might consider extremely valuable. And so while it's true that some of us are altruistic and an AI could be as well, I think it's still a narrow target. And then just a little comment on the goal preservation, and the Silicon Valley embodies lack of goal preservation because of the pivot. It's very few successful companies were the first idea of their founder. I would argue there that the building whatever product they wanted to build was a sub-goal. Their real goal was status, money, and fame. And that by pivoting, they're actually just changing the means to better attain that goal. That the goal hasn't fundamentally changed.
I don't fully disagree with you, but I don't fully agree with you. In the first case of self-preservation, I think people sacrifice themselves for other humans. I think that's right. But I also think they sacrifice themselves for ideals. Now, you might say, well, those ideals apply like freedom, justice, whatever. Those apply to human beings. That's true, but they're not, but it's not, if you will, the causal mechanism isn't one-to-one. It actually is an ideal. It is a value. It isn't actually the human being. That's only a secondary feature of it. Then in the case of the goal preservation, I don't see that. I think some people, I think, what is it, the fellow Adam, got his last name, from WeWork. Yeah, I think it was about money, fame, and fortune, and status, and whether it was going to be WeWork or something else. He was driven more by those qualities rather than the thing itself. But when you look at other entrepreneurs, and I'm thinking Sergey and Larry of Google, Bill Gates of Microsoft, it was really, and certainly the pioneers of the internet, certainly of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, but Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn and Steve Crocker of TCP/IP fame, the transmission control internet protocol, that created the network of the internet. They were motivated about the curiosity, the ambition, the challenge. It's like Everest, right? It was them against reality to make something, to put a dent in the universe. You know, why else would Steve Jobs have done what he did? He had enough money, had enough status, had enough power. Clearly there was something deeper that was compelling him.
Maybe just to complete the argument, the third sub-goal that is hypothesized that any rational agent would pursue is acquisition of resources. And this is perhaps where the argument reaches its pinnacle of danger for humanity, that if an AI is pursuing some goal and rationally deduces that it has to acquire lots and lots of resources in order to maximize that goal, even if it's arbitrary, like possessing paper clips or producing paper clips, in its limits, this would require acquiring resources in the world that we want as well. And so we have an agent now that is in competition with us for resources and sees us potentially as we see ants, where we don't really care either way about ants, but when they're in their way, we crush them.
I mean, all of this sounds so Jesuit. It sounds as if we're sort of we're taking our rational, argumentative selves for the joy of logos, if you will, to the nth degree, in the same way that famously the theologians would debate how many angels fit on the end of a pin. It seems to me this is just a reflection of the D&D culture of AI engineers, the Dungeons and Dragons culture of AI engineer, which is that the world resembles a board game like Risk, and they're applying all of these over intellectualized features to it. For example, if the world is really one in which we all maximize resources, I think there's a dimension to that, of course. I think that's one of our motivations, but it's not the dominant motivation. And if it were, we'd have a world of only people with red suspenders on Wall Street and speaking like Donald Trump, right? In Instead, you would never have a college professor, right, or a nurse, right, because they're not able to maximize resources to the nth degree. And you would have people who would be clobbering each other on the street to steal their Sainsbury's meal deal sandwiches because they wanted to maximize their resources where they could get it. But that's not the world we live in, right? Some people at The Economist, there's people here who've turned down jobs at Goldman Sachs, right, at multiples of their salary, right? That doesn't fit into the cosmology of the maximizing resource strategy, right? So what do we make of it? Well, the fact is that we are motivated in lots of different ways, and those motivations and those goals are all in tension with each other. So I don't think there's anything in the nature of an AI that's going to lead it to maximize resources. Although if we feed into the training data the worst of ourselves, of avarice and greed, and that is the vast preponderance of information with which it is making its neural connections of how to respond, yes, then it's going to look terrible. So why does the person not clobber someone else on the Strand and steal their chocolate-covered hobnobs? Now, one reason why is because they're afraid of going to jail, right? Another reason why is they're afraid as they're reaching for the milk chocolate covered hobnobs, the guy's going to sock him in the jaw, right? So those are two separate things. One is a civilizational, constraint. The other one is the physicality of the moment constraint. But there's going to be some people who just feel like, hey, that's not just. That's not right. That's not the society I want to live in. There's a value here I want to preserve of the dignity and the freedom of other people and the reciprocity that we owe each to each. That is a part of the human condition. It's the beauty of the human condition. It needs to be brought into AI, but the AI is not only going to encompass the worst. If it's going to be true to the world, it also has to encompass that element of it. And I see that missing from the analyses of the Yudkowskis and others.
Yeah, I agree that these reactions of, I will treat this other human being with dignity, and that's why I won't steal their sandwich, not just so I don't go to jail, is something very important that needs to be instilled into AIs, although I doubt they'll be buying sandwiches. But I want to push back on the idea that this all comes from the data it was trained on. I think that's true of LLMs, that they can replicate the good and the bad data that they were trained on. And if we feed them stories of AIs going rogue, then they are liable to replicate those stories, and that's what some papers have shown. And I don't take those super seriously because they are sort of playing a role. But this argument of Yudkowsky is that you don't need sort of templates of human behavior to decide what to do. You only need rationality. And if grant the premises for the moment that an AI would have a goal that it pursues singularly, then it doesn't need templates of, do humans change their goals? Do humans behave in this way or the other? It can instead say, what's the future state I want to get to? Now, rationally, working backwards, what are the actions I need to take in order to get to that goal? So no necessity for human data or templates there, only rationality.
Okay, where does it get its rationality from?
Well, that would be a recipe for how to build such an AI, and these arguments are meant to deal with, address the possibility we have such an AI without knowing what path led to it.
Okay, so what we now know is that we build our AI not through Lisp, the Lisp protocol, which the early AI where we actually try to enumerate all the if-then statements that we can and the exceptions to the rules, but through the data so that it can infer what to do. So typically if it's got right now under the current technique, if it has the rationality, it's through all of the information it can, it teases out the inferences and makes these connections itself rather than being instructed on what to do. So that was the great step change of the connectionist model rather than the symbolic model. Okay, so there it is through the data. But if you're saying that where it gets rationality is not through the data, it has to come from something, right?
Yes.
Well, where do we get our rationality from? Well, in the book Framers, as you pointed out, we know that we have this nature of these frames, these templates that we have to understand the world based on these three features of causality, counterfactuals, and constraints. And that is either through what we're born with, the neural endowment that we have that comes from instinct, and as well as other features of cognition. With tests with babies, they have innate causality. For example, if you hold a pen, you're about to drop it, as you're letting go, their eye will track down before the pen drops. So they're anticipating the pen to drop. So they will have a sense of causality before they are able to speak. Okay. And there's lots, and those, of course, famously with Alice and Gopnik, children are very good with counterfactual reasoning, right? They can even do it in some ways, some weird ways better than humans can, right? They follow it really well. So we have these natures to it. The AI is going to have that, but if it's going to have it, and even in the way that you've described it, they're probably either they're going to have it because they're an embodied being in the world living that has come with a neural network pre-established, like the one that we have, that is so vastly intricate that we're going to debate for years whether Chomsky's right, whether language is innate or whether it's not. The idea is that we come loaded with a program, we're hardwired, and we also get our software on top of it. So right now in your world, we just have the silicon. We don't have anything on it. There's no programming. It's just transistors. There's nothing there. What will be there? What will go there is a model, right? It's a model, right? It's the map, not the territory, right? It's the simulation, not the thing. So it's the weather report, not the weather. Okay, and those things are so functionally different that we can't confuse the model for the reality of itself. So I'd be very wary to say that this rationality, I mean, if you will, it's interesting that you're invoking a rationality, the logos, where I refer to it as the problem. You see it as you don't know where it's going to come from, but you do recognize that it's going to lead to problems. Well, yeah, but it's not because it's rationality per se, but it's because it's this simulacrum of rationality. It's that which has been compressed from all the vagaries of the world and reality that exists into what could be enumerated and fit onto a piece of silicon. That, to me, truly is artificial.
Yeah, I agree that we can't hypothesize that this rationality is going to pop out of nowhere, not have any predecessor. But likewise, did it not pop out of nowhere with humanity and other animals capable of rational thought? It came through training, through generations and generations of evolution. And so one way of getting rationality in a computer is it emulating human rationality by reading the text we produce. But that's just generative AI or classification. But there's instead other algorithms like genetic algorithms or reinforcement learning, where the data that the AI is learning from is experience, it's trial and error. And I see no reason why it couldn't learn rationality through trial and error and end up with a form of rationality or a form of goal that's quite alien to a human mind.
So I would agree with that, and I could even imagine, I can imagine a world in which it is better than humans. So just as there's super intelligence, that there's super morality, there's super consciousness, right? And what would super conscious mean? I mean, why? Right now we've got 5 senses, but we don't have radar, but we have the idea of radar, and we have the idea of bats, which have a form of, if you will, don't have vision, but can actually use the reflection of the sound waves as they're to understand the surface areas. So we conceptualize that. We can imagine all the different ways that we have an understanding of senses, and we can build a sensor for all those things. And let's say we have 100 different one of them, but in reality, there might be 1,000. So we're only got 10% of it. And actually, there's probably a lot more. How much more data or information can we get in the cosmos and in the world and in reality if we could only have a mechanism of collecting that information that surpasses our own senses, right? Well, and you could imagine an AI that is able to cogitate upon information that is unsensible or even incomprehensible, right, to us and our minds and our environment, maybe because of the speed, right? I mean, and the scale of it, but it can actually do it because it's either too tiny or too large, or it happens so quickly or too slowly to make it relevant, right? Maybe trees are talking to each other like we're talking to ourselves, but over tens or hundreds of years, so we don't hear it, right? I mean, this has been well established. Others have made these points before. So if that's the world, if that's possible, then AI might have this heightened sense of the moral, right? It might have this heightened sense of consciousness, and I'll like totally accept that. But I will say, therefore, it's interesting. It won't be human consciousness. And is there something special about human consciousness? Well, I think it is. I mean, so far it seems like we have these features of the world that we can put our imprint on that other animals can't. But I don't want to be a speciesist to say that we are the end point of the universe's evolution. Certainly, machines will be able to do extraordinary things as well. It won't be alive. It won't be alive like us. But I will admit, as we started at the beginning, it's going to go in places that we don't understand and will surprise us.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for coming on, Ken Cukier. I've had a great chat. I'm so glad we got to do a more long-form conversation where we could go more in depth on your views. Thank you.
Likewise, this was a lot of fun. Great questions, and I loved having the conversation.
Had lots more questions about nationalization and authoritarianism that I think you would enjoy.
Totally. Yeah.
I'll have to wait to another time. I've pushed my time right to the limit now.
That's great. No, this is a lot of fun.
So where can people find you if they want to hear more from you?
Cukier.com is my website. The Economist.com is where I work. And I've got my Substack at chiefwordofficer.ai.
I'll be sure to take a look, and I'll put the link in the show notes. Thanks so much.
I appreciate it. Take care. Thanks.